Nathan had always been the kind of man who double-checked everything. His conference in Chicago was going well, and the plan was to return Sunday evening, give Rachel space to relax, and surprise her with a bracelet he had secretly designed months ago. But halfway through the hotel lobby, he patted his coat pocket and froze. The small navy blue velvet box was missing. He must have left it on the dresser back home. He didn't call or text her. He wanted to keep the surprise intact. It would only take him 3 hours to drive back, grab the bracelet, and return before anyone even noticed he was gone. It felt like a sweet, spontaneous gesture. The kind couples later tell their kids about. When he pulled into the driveway, he noticed Rachel's car parked outside. That wasn't unusual. But the second he stepped out of his vehicle, something inside him shifted. There was a light on in the living room, a soft flicker through the curtains, and music playing low. It was the playlist they only put on for special nights. Their anniversary songs. His heart fluttered, but unease coiled in his gut. As Nathan slid the key into the lock and turned the knob, he noticed the faintest hesitation, as if his own hand didn't want him to open the door, but the door clicked open easily. The warmth of the home wrapped around him. Candles were lit on the coffee table. A bottle of wine was half empty, and then he saw it. A second wine glass. Not his. He stepped inside quietly, his footsteps silent on the wood floor. The hallway stretched longer than usual. Something was wrong. Not just wrong, but off, like walking into a memory that doesn't belong to you. That's when he heard it. A laugh. Not Rachel's laugh. Not the pure one he fell in love with, but something huskier, paired with another voicemail, familiar. His pulse quickened. He didn't need to walk farther. He already knew, but still he did. And that's when he saw them. Rachel in a blanket, legs curled beside her, and Dylan, his own cousin, sitting just inches away, shirtless, her hand on his thigh, his smile wide. The intimacy in the room was unmistakable. And just like that, everything he thought was solid cracked. Nathan didn't say a word at first. He simply stood in the doorway, frozen in place, while the image before him seared itself into his brain. Rachel, wrapped in their shared blanket, the one they had cuddled under countless Friday nights, now draped over her and Dylan like some cruel parody of intimacy. Dylan was the first to notice him. His smile faltered for just a split second, just long enough for Nathan to see it wasn't guilt in his cousin's eyes. It was something far worse, smugness, as if he'd won some twisted game. Rachel turned her head slowly, confusion flickering across her face before the color drained from it entirely. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her hand slipped off Dylan's leg and clutched the edge of the blanket like it was armor. But there was no hiding what Nathan had seen. The wine, the candlelight, the silence between them when he walked in. It said everything her mouth was too slow to deny. "Nathan," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "What are you? You said you wouldn't be back until Sunday." That was her first reaction. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "It's not what it looks like." Not even shame, just surprise that she'd been caught too soon. Nathan's hands were clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. He didn't yell, he didn't throw anything. Instead, he just stared at Rachel, blinking slowly, like he was trying to wake up from a dream, a really bad one. His gaze flicked to Dylan, who was still sitting there like this was awkward but manageable, like he could talk his way out of this. "I left something," Nathan said, voice level. "Didn't think I'd come back to find this instead." Dylan stood up then, reaching for his shirt. "Look, man." Nathan raised a hand to silence him, and Dylan actually paused. "No," Nathan said flatly. "You don't get to talk. Not in this house." Rachel moved as if to stand too, to explain, but Nathan turned his eyes to her and she sank back down. "How long?" he asked. The question landed heavy in the air. Rachel didn't answer at first. The silence stretched so long it became its own confession. Then she looked down, her voice barely audible. A few weeks, as if that made it any better, as if her betrayal being recent softened the blow. Nathan laughed, a short, bitter sound, and stepped backward toward the door. "I came to grab a bracelet," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. "One I had made. Thought it would look good on your wrist, thought you'd love it." Rachel covered her face with her hands. Dylan mumbled something again, But Nathan didn't hear it. His ears were ringing. The house felt suffocating, like the walls themselves were rejecting the weight of the lie that had just spilled out. "I'll be back for my things tomorrow," Nathan said quietly, his voice shaking now. "Don't be here." He didn't wait for a response. Didn't look back. The front door opened, then shut with a finality that echoed in all three of their bones. And Rachel, left sitting in the dim light of the candles meant for someone else, finally started to cry. Nathan didn't sleep that night. He spent it in his car, parked outside an all-night diner, staring at the bracelet on the passenger seat. A delicate chain with a charm shaped like a compass. A quiet nod to one of Rachel's favorite quotes. "No matter where you go, I'll always find my way back to you." Now, that phrase felt like a cruel joke. His phone buzzed several times throughout the night. All from Rachel. First texts, then calls, then voice messages that started soft and regretful but eventually cracked into desperation. He didn't open a single one. At around 3:27 a.m. Dylan messaged him. Just one line. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Nathan stared at the message for a full minute, then locked his phone and tossed it into the glove box. What did that even mean? Did Dylan mean he didn't mean to kiss her, sleep with her, or just that he didn't expect to get caught? The betrayal tasted different coming from Dylan. It wasn't just about love or lust. It was family, childhood birthdays, Christmas mornings, broken bones and broken hearts. They'd been through everything together. Nathan had confided in Dylan more than anyone, including Rachel. And now that bond felt like something he'd never really had at all. By sunrise, Nathan still hadn't moved. He just sat there, numb, watching the golden light spill across the windshield. In that quiet moment, it hit him. The part that hurt the most wasn't that Rachel had cheated. It was that he'd never suspected a thing. No distance, no coldness, no fights. Just an ordinary Thursday night turned into the moment his world caved in. And now the silence she left in her place filled every corner of his chest. At 7:04 a.m. He finally turned the key and drove home. Not to forgive, not to talk, just to gather his things and leave. But when he opened the front door, Rachel was there. Sitting on the floor, still in the same clothes, eyes red-rimmed and puffy. Her makeup had long since melted away, leaving her face pale and raw. "Nathan," she breathed, standing up quickly, her voice thick. "Please, can we talk?" He didn't answer. He walked past her, straight to their shared bedroom, opened the closet, and began pulling out his clothes. Methodically, quietly, behind him, Rachel hovered in the doorway, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "It didn't mean anything," she said, as if that somehow erased it. Nathan froze for a second, then slowly turned his head toward her. "It meant enough to undress for him," he said coldly. "So don't insult both of us by calling it nothing." Rachel flinched like he'd slapped her. She tried again. "I didn't plan it, okay? It just happened." He zipped his duffel bag. "Yeah, like most car crashes." Then he paused, reached into his pocket, and placed the bracelet on the edge of the dresser, not angrily, just carefully, gently, as if it still held meaning, even if she no longer did. And without another word, Nathan left again. This time, Rachel didn't follow. Dylan didn't sleep either. After Rachel had broken down crying in his apartment and then abruptly left, he sat on the floor with his back against the couch, staring at the dark ceiling. The silence around him was crushing, interrupted only by the occasional creak of old wood or the distant hum of city traffic. He wasn't proud. Not even close. His stomach churned every time he replayed the moment. Rachel leaning in, his own hands not pulling away, and that kiss that had turned into so much more. At first, he had convinced himself it was a one-time mistake, that it had been fueled by too many late-night drinks, unresolved feelings, and bad judgment. But deep down, Dylan knew it hadn't started that night. It started weeks ago. Subtle glances across dinner tables, too long hugs after family gatherings, quiet conversations when Nathan left the room. He had felt it building, but instead of shutting it down, he'd fed it with attention, with smiles, with comfort. He had watched his best friend's girlfriend fall apart under stress and exhaustion, and instead of helping her stand, he had leaned in just close enough to catch her when she stumbled. And now he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He grabbed his phone, thumb hovering over Nathan's contact for what felt like an hour. Finally, he typed, "I didn't mean for it to go this far," but as soon as he sent it, he knew how pathetic it sounded, a coward's way of admitting guilt without truly taking responsibility. His phone buzzed once. Not from Nathan, but from Rachel. A voice message. He couldn't bring himself to open it. He didn't want to hear her crying again. It made it all feel too real. The next morning, Dylan stood in front of the mirror, studying his reflection. His face looked the same jawline, same short brown hair, same tired eyes. But something inside had shifted. He had betrayed the one person in the world who had trusted him completely. There was a photo on his bookshelf. Him and Nathan in college, arms slung over each other's shoulders, both grinning like idiots. He knocked it down without meaning to and didn't bother picking it up. Guilt clung to his skin like sweat. He thought about going to Nathan's apartment, explaining everything in person. But he knew it was too late for that. Some bridges, once burned, don't leave enough behind to rebuild. So he poured himself a glass of water, sat down on the edge of the bed, and whispered to the empty room, "I screwed up, and I don't deserve to be forgiven." And the worst part? He was right. Nathan arrived home earlier than expected. His business trip had wrapped up ahead of schedule. The client meeting in Denver had been postponed, and the early flight home felt like a small gift. He smiled to himself as he stepped off the plane, imagining the look on Rachel's face when he surprised her. Maybe he'd stop by her favorite bakery first, pick up those strawberry croissants she loved so much. He hadn't told her. He wanted it to be a moment, a soft hug from behind, a kiss on the cheek, and maybe that weekend he'd finally bring up the idea of getting engaged. They'd been together 4 years long enough, and lately, he'd caught himself staring at her across the breakfast table, thinking, "I want this forever." He took a cab from the airport straight to their apartment. The driver chatted about the weather, but Nathan barely listened. His mind was spinning with thoughts of Rachel, how she'd be curled up with tea, her favorite playlist echoing softly through the speakers. Maybe still in her pajamas. He smiled, but as soon as he stepped into the building, something in his chest tightened. The elevator ride felt too long, the hallway too quiet. When he slid his key into the lock and opened the door, the warmth he expected to feel, that comfort of home, didn't greet him. There were 2 mugs on the coffee table, 2 phones, a man's jacket. He heard movement from the living room, laughter cut short, and then he saw them. Rachel, her hair mussed, sweater falling off one shoulder, her eyes wide in horror, and beside her on the couch, shirtless, scrambling to stand, was Dylan, his best friend. Nathan didn't speak. Couldn't. He just stood there, his travel bag still over his shoulder, as time ground to a halt around him. The air turned heavy, like it didn't want to move. Rachel gasped his name, but he didn't respond. He couldn't look away. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was who had done it. Dylan, the man who'd helped him move into this apartment. The man who stood by his side when his mom passed. The man who toasted him last year, saying, "You and Rachel are the real thing, bro." Nathan's heart didn't just break. It fractured. His fingers curled tightly around the bag strap until his knuckles turned white. He didn't shout, didn't throw anything. He just looked at them like they were strangers. Like the people he trusted most in the world were suddenly made of glass, already shattered. He turned without a word. Rachel cried out, her voice cracking, "Nathan, wait, I can explain." But he didn't stop. He walked out the door, into the hallway, and kept walking. Every step echoed like thunder in his chest. Nathan didn't go home that night. He didn't even know where he was going when he stepped out into the street. Just that he couldn't breathe inside that apartment anymore. The betrayal clung to his skin like smoke, choking every rational thought. He wandered aimlessly through the city, his suitcase trailing behind him like dead weight. The streetlights flickered, and for the first time in a long time, He realized how alone he truly was. It wasn't just Rachel's infidelity. It wasn't just Dylan's deception. It was the way it all unraveled so quietly, without warning, no screaming matches, no suspicion. Just silence, and then chaos. Nathan ended up at a cheap motel just outside the city. The receptionist barely looked up as he checked in. He paid in cash. Didn't leave his name. Inside the tiny, cold room, he collapsed onto the edge of the bed. The bag dropped to the floor with a dull thud. For a long time, he just sat there, staring at the wall, still wearing the same clothes he had left the airport in. Then, almost robotically, he reached into the side pocket of his bag. The ring box was still there. He opened it slowly, almost expecting the diamond inside to have dulled, as if it too had been tainted. But it was still pristine, sparkling, innocent. Unlike Rachel, Nathan stared at the ring for a long time. He tried to remember the last time he felt sure about her. Was it at that barbecue with her parents? Or when they danced in the kitchen that Sunday morning? He didn't know anymore. His memories were now fractured, rewritten by betrayal. His phone buzzed for the 10th time. Rachel. He didn't answer, couldn't. But the messages came anyway. Nathan. Please. It wasn't what it looked like. Can we talk? I made a mistake. Please don't shut me out. He put the phone face down and laid back on the bed. The ceiling was cracked. So was he. Rachel sat alone on the floor of their apartment, her knees pulled to her chest, the silence around her louder than any argument she had ever had with Nathan. The echo of the door slamming when he left still rang in her ears. His suitcase was gone. So was he, and she had no idea if he would ever come back. She had called, texted, left voice messages, each one sounding more desperate than the last. But Nathan wasn't answering. Rachel wasn't even sure what to say anymore. How do you apologize for something that shattered someone's trust so completely? How do you explain something when you barely understood it yourself? She glanced at the wine glass on the table, still half full from the night before. The same night she had let Dylan kiss her. The same night she didn't stop him. Dylan had been around for months. He was Nathan's friend, someone they had both trusted. At first, it was harmless. A few shared laughs when Nathan was away, innocent conversations about books, about music. Rachel had convinced herself it was nothing. But somewhere along the line, the boundaries had blurred, and she hadn't stopped it. That night, when Dylan leaned in, Rachel didn't pull away fast enough. She kissed him back, just for a few seconds, but that was enough. And then, like the universe punishing her in real time, the front door had opened. Nathan's voice, confused, distant, and then he saw them. The look on his face haunted her. Not anger, not even betrayal, just disappointment, the kind that crushed everything inside her. Now, the apartment felt foreign. Everything reminded her of him. The mug he always used, the blanket they cuddled under on movie nights, the framed photo by the bookshelf, the one from their weekend in Seattle, where Nathan had wrapped his arms around her and whispered, "I could do forever with you." She clutched her phone again, debating whether to try once more, but what could she even say? It didn't mean anything. A lie. I was confused. A coward's excuse. I love you, and I made a terrible mistake. The only truth she had left. She opened a blank message and began typing. Nathan, please, I never meant to hurt you. I love you. I was stupid and selfish, and I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm still here. If you ever want to talk, I'll be here. She hit send and waited, but there was no reply, only silence. Nathan sat alone in the passenger seat of his brother's car, watching the streetlights blur past the window like smudges of golden ink. He hadn't said much since leaving the apartment. His brother, Jeremy, knew better than to press. Silence hung thick between them, broken only by the soft hum of tires against pavement. In Nathan's jacket pocket was a small velvet box, heavier now than it had ever felt before. He had carried that box with him on his trip, planning to come home Sunday evening, drop to one knee in their living room, and ask Rachel to be his wife. He had rehearsed the words in his head 1,000 times, thought about her reaction, her tears, the smile he loved, but all of that had shattered the second he walked through the door and saw her. Not alone, not waiting for him, but beside Dylan. The betrayal had hit him like a freight train. The one person he trusted most had chosen the one person who should have been untouchable. Now, the ring in his pocket felt like a cruel joke. He pulled it out and opened it slowly. The diamond caught the light, still perfect, still waiting for a future that no longer existed. His fingers curled around the box as his jaw clenched. "I was going to ask her this weekend." Nathan finally said aloud, voice dry and low. Jeremy glanced over briefly, then looked back at the road. "I know. I thought she was the one. I really did. I know, man." Nathan closed the box and placed it back in his pocket. Do you think people ever really know who they're with? I mean, you can live with someone, share a bed, laugh together, build a life, and still not see it coming. Jeremy didn't answer at first. Sometimes we see it coming. We just don't want to believe it. Nathan looked out the window again. The streets were quiet, the world indifferent. He thought of all the little moments that now felt poisoned. Rachel's warm smile when he'd leave for work, her text saying "miss you," the playlist she made for his trip, all of it, layered in lies. He had been planning forever, and she hadn't even planned to stop. The pain twisted inside him like a knife. The next morning, Nathan stood in the kitchen of his brother's apartment. Staring blankly at a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, steam curled upward in lazy spirals. But his thoughts were too heavy to drift with it. He hadn't slept at all. Not even a minute. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rachel's face and Dylan's shirt on the floor. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Rachel. "Please, let me explain." He didn't open it. He didn't need to. There were already 5 unread messages above it, all with the same desperate tone. Apologies, excuses, cries for forgiveness. But not once did she say it hadn't happened. Not once did she deny it. Jeremy entered the kitchen, rubbing his eyes and yawning. "You okay?" he asked gently, already knowing the answer. Nathan gave a weak nod, but his voice was hoarse. "She's been texting non-stop. I haven't answered. You don't have to, not yet, or maybe not ever. I don't even know what I'd say if I did." Jeremy leaned against the counter. "She made her choice. Nate, you caught her in it. There's no walking that back." Nathan looked up. His eyes were red, but dry now. The tears had stopped hours ago. I keep thinking about how normal everything felt. Like, that morning before I left, we had pancakes. She kissed me goodbye like nothing was wrong. How do you do that? How do you smile at someone you're betraying? His voice cracked at the last sentence, and he gripped the edge of the countertop to keep himself steady. Jeremy didn't respond right away. He walked over and put a hand on Nathan's shoulder, because she thought she had time, because she thought you'd never know. Nathan let out a bitter laugh. Well, surprise. Later that day, as the hours dragged on, Nathan finally gave in to his need for closure. Not for her sake, but he opened her most recent text. The words were shaky, like they were typed through tears. "I didn't plan for this to happen. It meant nothing. I was lonely. You were gone so much. I love you. Please come home." He read it once, then again. And then he deleted the whole thread. Rachel had mistaken his absence for permission. She mistook his trust for something disposable. Nathan grabbed the ring box from his jacket again. This time, he didn't open it. He walked outside, walked for blocks until he found a quiet little park, and sat on a bench near the water. He held the box in his palm, and then, without a word, tossed it into the lake. It didn't make a big splash, just a soft plop. But for Nathan, it was the loudest sound in the world. The proposal that never happened was finally buried. And now, all that was left was whatever came next. Nathan hadn't planned to see Rachel again so soon, or ever if he could help it. But fate, or maybe just cruel coincidence, had other ideas. It was late afternoon when he stopped by the cafe near his old apartment to grab a coffee. He hadn't been back in this neighborhood since he left, and he almost turned around as soon as he saw the familiar sidewalk and the flower shop they used to pass on their evening walks. But he needed the closure, or something that resembled it. As he waited for his coffee, He heard a voice behind him, soft, familiar, hesitant. "Nathan." He turned slowly, and there she was. Rachel looked like a shadow of the woman he once loved. Her eyes were puffy from crying, hair pulled back in a loose bun, like she hadn't slept in days. She clutched her phone tightly in one hand like it was the only thing holding her together. Nathan didn't say anything. She stepped closer, nervously glancing around as if the whole world was watching. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said. "I've been trying to talk to you. You won't answer." "Because there's nothing left to say," Nathan replied, his voice steady but flat. Rachel looked like she'd been punched. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unsure where to start. Can we talk, please?" "5 minutes." Nathan gave a slow nod, not for her, but for himself. They moved to a quiet table in the corner. The silence between them was thick. Rachel finally broke it. "I made a mistake," she whispered. Nathan stared at her. "No, Rachel. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or saying something cruel in a fight. You made a choice, over and over." Her hands trembled as she held her cup. "I didn't think you'd come home. I thought I had time to." He cut her off. "Time to cheat without getting caught." She flinched. "I was going to propose," he continued, voice low but shaking now. "That weekend, I had the ring. I had the whole thing planned, and you were in our bed with someone else." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to ruin everything." Nathan looked away, jaw clenched. "But you did." A pause. Then she reached across the table, her fingers barely brushing his. "I still love you." That was the final crack in the illusion. He pulled his hand back. "No, Rachel, you don't betray the people you love. You don't tear them apart and call it loneliness. You don't throw away everything we built and still get to say you love me." Her breath hitched, but she said nothing. Nathan stood. "I'm done being the only one who fought for us." He didn't wait for a response. He walked out of the cafe, the bell above the door jingling like a cruel reminder of the life he left behind. And this time, he didn't look back. The days after the cafe encounter passed in slow, heavy silence. Nathan returned to his small apartment across town, the one he moved into after leaving the place he once shared with Rachel. The walls were bare. The room still felt temporary, like he hadn't truly settled into his new life yet. But something had shifted inside him after that conversation. He hadn't just walked out of the cafe. He had walked out of the last remnants of what they used to be. He didn't answer Rachel's texts. There were 3 the first night. One said, "I'm sorry." Another, "Please talk to me." And the last one, just before midnight, "I miss you." He read them once, then deleted them, not out of spite, but because he couldn't keep reopening wounds that would never heal if he kept scratching them. Instead, he poured himself into work. Long hours at the office, extra projects, late nights filled with spreadsheets and silence. But even then, he'd catch himself pausing mid-email, staring blankly at the screen, remembering things he never asked to remember. The way Rachel used to hum while brushing her teeth. The way she always stole his hoodies. The Sunday morning pancakes. He hated that grief didn't feel like fire. It felt like fog, heavy, slow, always there, clinging to him like damp clothes he couldn't shake off. One evening, after an exhausting meeting, Nathan stopped by the grocery store. As he walked past the frozen foods aisle, he spotted Rachel's favorite brand of ice cream, chocolate chip with caramel swirls. Without thinking, he reached out. Then he froze. His hand hovered in front of the door, trembling slightly, and after a long second, he pulled it back. "She's not your responsibility anymore," he whispered to himself. That night, he finally unpacked the last box in his apartment. It was the one he had been avoiding, the box filled with shared memories. Printed photos, old birthday cards, love notes scribbled on the backs of receipts. He sat on the floor, going through each item slowly, deliberately, not crying, just letting go. He placed the ring box, the one he had never returned, into a drawer deep beneath winter scarves and gloves. Not to hide it, but to bury it with intention. By midnight, the apartment still wasn't filled with laughter or joy, but it was peaceful. And for the first time in months, Nathan slept without waking up in the middle of the night, haunted by what-ifs, because maybe healing didn't come all at once. Maybe it came in small, quiet moments, and maybe that was enough for now. Weeks passed. The city shifted into spring. Trees blooming, windows opening, people smiling again. But Nathan still felt like he was living slightly out of sync with the world, as if he was watching life through a fogged-up window he couldn't wipe clean. The pain had dulled, but it hadn't vanished. One Sunday morning, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper. It wasn't just paper. It was the letter. The one he had written in his mind 100 times but never dared to put into words. He took a deep breath, picked up a pen, and finally let it all spill out. "Rachel, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe it's better if you don't. But I need to say these words, even if they never reach you. You broke something in me. Something I didn't think could be broken. And yet, I still remember you with softness. I still see us on the couch, tangled in each other, laughing about nothing. I still hear your voice singing along to the radio, a little off-key but full of joy. You lied to me, you betrayed me, but somehow I don't hate you. Maybe I should, but I don't. I've accepted that I'll never understand why. Maybe you were lost. Maybe you thought you needed something else. Maybe you just made a mistake you couldn't undo. I'm not writing to forgive you. I'm writing to let you go, because holding on to this pain, this ache, it's keeping me from living. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. Rachel, I hope you become someone you can live with. As for me, I'll be okay. I'm learning to breathe again. Goodbye, Nathan." He set the letter down, not crying, just breathing for the first time in months. The air didn't feel so heavy. Nathan never mailed the letter. He folded it once, gently, and placed it in the same drawer where the ring now rested. Both symbols of a future that never came. Later that day, he went out for coffee. The sky was bright. The world felt louder somehow, but in a way that no longer overwhelmed him. He noticed a girl at the cafe counter smiling kindly at him. He smiled back. It didn't mean anything, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all healing needs. Not a grand finale, but a quiet, honest beginning.